Everybody, please take your seats when you can. That's all apart from Henry Dimbleby, who I'd asked to take a seat over there, if that's all right. So you're allowed to move around. Well, thank you very much for coming back in. A good time. I hope you enjoyed a little refreshment and coffee and snacks. Great time this morning, and now we're back for the market and economic outlook with NFU President Tom Bradshaw, and Henry Dimbleby, who I will give a better introduction to later, but I guess needs no introduction in this environment. But first of all, Tom Bradshaw, NFU President.
Good afternoon, everybody. As you can imagine, my presentation's probably changed a bit since what it might have looked like 2 weeks ago. If we went back 2 weeks, we still hadn't had the dreaded news from the budget, which unfortunately has created so much consternation for the industry. But I guess what I really want to focus on is what I think is important to you, and that's confidence. Because if you have a farming sector that is confident, you have a farming sector that's willing to invest, you have a farming sector that will provide the outputs that you need, and be buying the inputs that you're selling. And confidence is absolutely central to that. Now, back in April, we published our confidence survey results after what had been an incredibly challenging winter of weather. These created quite a shockwave in themselves. And the shadow team at the time, Secretary of State Steve Reed, or now Secretary of State Steve Reed, and Daniel Zeichner, made a lot out of those confidence figures. They said, we will rebuild the confidence of the industry. We recognize the importance of having stability, of having policies in place that enable you to invest with confidence for the future. It's also been very notable recently that both at our summer reception that we organized only 2 weeks after the election, we had over 100 MPs through. And the Food Security Minister, Daniel Zeichner, stood on a platform and recognized the mental health challenges that our industry is facing. They are very real challenges. And what I say now, I don't say lightly. Steve Reed stood on a platform in September on Back British Farming Day, recognizing those same pressures that our industry is facing today and committing to do all they can to help the industry work their way through these challenges. And the reason I think that is important is because we've also had Sir Keir Starmer talk at our conference. He wanted a new relationship with the countryside, one based on genuine partnership and respect. He recognized that when you lose a family farm, it's not like losing any other family business. You don't get it back again. Now, I'm afraid those words today seem hollow. They seem meaningless. They seem disrespectful. And we have an industry that's feeling betrayed. Secretary of State Steve Reed stood on a platform last November and said that the agricultural property relief would not be touched. We know now that that's not true. If I go back to the manifestos at the end of May, well, actually, the election was called the end of May. The manifestos came out slightly later. Now, there may not have been many words in the Labour manifesto, but there were some really, really important words. Food security is national security. Are they words? Do they mean something to you in this audience? Do they resonate with you? Does that give you something that you as an industry believe you can invest in for the future? It gave me hope. It gave me belief. It gave me the start of a new relationship. We'd had a lot of problems over the last 5 years. We'd had a huge amount of volatility. Probably the 8 years since Brexit had created a lot of nervousness in the industry, the trade deals, the different prime ministers, the revolving doors of secretaries of state. This was a new start that was being promised. And the foundation stones that then helped deliver that, they only want to import food produced to the highest animal health and welfare standards. Now, trade is absolutely essential. The NFU has always stood for fair trade, not free trade. And they are very, very different things. And those core standards, those high welfare standards, something we can absolutely support. But if I look at our poultry industry today, The retailers are forcing us to move down from 38 to 30 kilograms. I have absolutely no problem if every chicken produced in this country is produced to 30 kilograms per meter squared. What I have a problem with is those retailers that are asking for that to be done. The moment the chicken becomes invisible in their ready meals, in their sandwiches, they're bringing in Polish, Thai, or Brazilian. Now, that's not fair. That doesn't enable the market to function properly. Because if we're serious about creating food security and creating the dynamics that deliver food security for the future, we need an economic marketplace that can really function. There was a question for Robert Sheesby earlier on about premiums for regenerative production. You can never get those premiums if you're being undermined by imports produced to completely different standards. The British chicken might have a small premium, but the moment that premium becomes too far, suddenly more Polish, more Thai, more Brazilian comes in. We have no control over the standards. The Polish is produced to 42 kilograms per meter squared. We don't know the production standards in Thailand or in Brazil. These are challenges that if we want to deliver food security, if we want to invest, if you want to produce the feed, we have to have a fair supply chain and one that enables the marketplace to operate properly so that we can afford to invest in those facilities on farm that then enable your businesses to thrive. Because if we don't have the production facilities, you don't have the demand. At the moment, I worry we're in a degenerative cycle where we're simply going to produce less. And that is not one that will excite you in this room, because that's not one that gives you the future that you need. I then had them talking about fairness in the supply chain. Again, I've talked there about poultry. I've got no problem, as I say, going to higher welfare standards. What I have a real problem with is duplicity. And that is where fairness in the supply chain is not about price. It is about making sure we have fair competition. And that is absolutely essential to enable the marketplace to work. They talked about public procurement and only wanting to source 50% of domestic production, or public procurement spent on domestic production. That's £5 billion a year. May not be the highest value market, but it brings carcass balance. It enables us to have that demand at the lower end of our supply chain. It helps build confidence. It helps create investment. They said they're going to change planning policy that enables us to invest for the future. At the moment, planning is a restrictive policy rather than an enabling policy. We need the energy infrastructure that the minister spoke about, but the grid capacity to enable my members to invest in solar, in small-scale wind, is prohibitively expensive. So we need massive reform there to enable us really to be able to take advantage of all those rooftops around the country that can host solar panels without impacting anything else. We want permitted development rights for small-scale wind, solar, wind, battery storage, helping provide for the local energy infrastructure. It's really exciting. It's something that we should be able to do, but so far it hasn't been done. When I look at slurry infrastructure, again, absolutely vital that for your future, our members are investing in their businesses. At the moment, trying to get planning permission for a slurry store in many areas is just about impossible because of nutrient neutrality. Yet that slurry store guarantees food production for the next 10 or 20 years, for the next generation. Because once you've invested £250,000 today, you don't stop food production tomorrow. So we need to make sure that the planning rules really enable the development in the food system that we want for the future. And they wonder why the industry is so cross today. Because they said they were going to do all of those things. They said they weren't going to change agricultural property relief. They haven't done any of them yet. They've done the one thing they said they weren't going to do. And with that, they've ripped the rug from underneath the industry. They've really ripped the confidence out of the industry. And they wonder why there is visceral anger amongst farmers today. I hope with what I've told you there, you can understand it. We'd also like to see tax incentives. So if they want a conversation about tax, let's have a conversation about how we drive sustainable investment, about how if we're going to be investing in climate-smart agriculture for the future, let's do that through the tax system rather than through grants out of DEFRA, which are too clunky to try and get them lined up. You have to get the grant window, you have to get planning permission, you have to get the Environment Agency, sometimes you need Natural England. Trying to get all that lined up within a grant window is just about impossible. So we could do that through the tax system. And then we could have a conversation around agricultural property relief. And I'm actually not adverse to there being changes to agricultural property relief, but they need to be the right changes. When I sat down with the Treasury Minister the Monday after the budget, James Murray, I sat opposite him and I said, James, all I want to know is what was the question? If you can tell me the question, I can help you. I can help answer the problem that you're trying to solve. There is no question. The answer was £22 billion. That's why we've got such a blunt instrument that really is not fit for the future. And I'm sorry, when the minister sat there and he ignores the human impact of this, that is wrong. Absolutely wrong. Until 1:30 on Wednesday, the 30th of October, the best tax advice was to die with your farm. Today, that's not possible. And there's been no opportunity to plan. Now, that is not right. The human impact of that is not acceptable. And this government have got to wake up to what they've done. So they wonder why we cross. They wonder why the industry is going to London. And that is why. Because they are just tone deaf to the human impact. And when I hear of 93-year-olds that own a 360-acre farm that aren't expected to live for 7 years, that's wrong. You know, we cannot, as an industry, accept that we just give up on this. And so passions are running high. Probably none more so than me. But that is why. And then just yesterday, climate change, I would still say, is the industry's biggest threat. But just yesterday, what did the Prime Minister say in response to a question? We need to see a 20% reduction in meat and dairy consumption. Where's the consultation? Where's the science and the evidence that sits behind that? They talk about rebuilding confidence. They talk about partnership and respect. This feels like anything but partnership and respect and rebuilding confidence. And even if there is dietary change in this country, if we're in the upper quartile of the least impact of the carbon footprint from producing that meat anywhere in the world, that gives us permission to produce. Anyone that's naive enough to think that we're going to get calories from nowhere, that there's going to be no planetary impact from feeding 10 billion people on this planet, sorry, we're naive. We have to earn permission to produce, which means we need to be in the upper quartile in the world. I'm absolutely focused on driving efficiency and productivity. But we also need the metrics. It's very, very easy for us to produce less. But if we produce less that has a higher footprint, rather than less that has a lower footprint, we're not solving the world's problems. And at the moment, we're looking at this through the blinkers of how we solve climate change for our island, but climate change is a global issue. It's not something we solve as the UK. It's something we solve by cooperating globally. We've heard about the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Now, maybe they are needed, but if they're needed, we have to have a carbon tax on everything else that is coming into the country produced with that same fertilizer, which otherwise we're going to be disadvantaged for. Now, that's really complicated. Very, very complicated. We need global metrics that are going to enable us to calculate the impact of this. And at the moment, we don't have the capability to do that. But we're just going to say, well, fertilizer has an impact. 4 billion people are alive in this planet because of artificial fertilizer. If we use the latest science and evidence to keep people alive, the latest science and technology, don't you think we have to use that latest science and technology to feed people? And that's where the gene editing bill is actually really exciting. I'm delighted that the government have decided that they will go ahead with the gene editing bill. Clearly, that was quite a big political challenge. And that is something that they are implementing, which for the long term can have real benefits. But I do need to go back to the budget very quickly. Because when the Chancellor stood up and said, invest, 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 I was really excited. The future you need, the future our members need, the future for food security is businesses that have got the confidence to invest for the future. But after that, we saw an inflationary budget that doesn't deliver anything, as far as I can see, for the food industry, that's going to drive up food prices. It has to, because our members have got nothing left to give. And anyone in this room involved in the supply chain, don't expect the farmers to be able to absorb any of these cost increases, because there is nothing left. And they have to go up the supply chain. When I hear Tesco saying that their NI is going to cost them £1 billion alone, I'd love to understand what the compound impact of those NI increases is for everybody underneath them in the supply chain. It's way more than £1 billion. And that has to go up the supply chain. And I'm afraid I see that as driving inflation. So I'd love to be more positive standing here today. And hopefully in a year's time, we might have turned a corner. Government might have listened. They might have understood. It takes a hell of a lot, particularly for government, to stand up and say, we're wrong. But they have misunderstood this policy. I don't believe it's vindictive. I genuinely think they have just misunderstood the really human implications of the changes that they've made. And they absolutely have to change, and they need to do that very, very quickly to remove that pressure on the industry that they've said they recognize is very, very real. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. And now Henry Dimbleby, author of the National Food Strategy, a businessman, co-founder of Leon Restaurants, and a really influential voice, not least on me, actually, in this area. So, Henry Dimbleby.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's absolutely fascinating to be here. It's great to be here, and having had a chance to read the Agri Supply Action Plan, really a kind of agenda for radical change in your sector. I agree with Robert that there is an opportunity for huge growth in this sector, but I think that so far today we haven't really grasped both the scale of the opportunity and the scale of the jeopardy. We, in Ravenous, I didn't bring my book, Tom, I should have brought it, and I can't sadly sign, but actually Tom's book, Land Smart, is excellent, and I highly recommend it. So in Ravenous, to try and kind of explain how things suddenly changed, we had a photograph of the New York streets in 1903 and then one in 1913. And in 1903, it was all horses all the way down 3rd Avenue with one, you could just see one car. And in 1913, it was all cars and there was one horse. 10 years, and in those 10 years, industries that had lasted for thousands of years disappeared. Families that had bred horses, that had made carts, that had designed wheels, street cleaners, the whole thing was wiped out. And the food system at the moment is responsible for $12 trillion of GDP. That's 12% of global GDP. It employs a third of the global workforce. And according to the UN's latest State of Agriculture report, it does harms to health, the environment, and social harms that cost $13 trillion a year. So it does more harms than the financial value it creates. And governments worldwide are beginning to wake up to this. If you went to COP in Glasgow, which was theoretically the biodiversity COP, so it was meant to be about biodiversity, food is the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. Food wasn't at COP in Glasgow. In Dubai, it was front and center. By Brazil, all countries will have to have food climate plans. And at the COP in Cali, there are murmurings that they'll have to have biodiversity plans too. And what you're going to see as basically what that means is that $12 trillion will have to be created in a completely different form. And what that means is that incumbent companies who are nimble-footed will gain in some of that value, but there is a huge opportunity for small companies to gain value, to move to that new form of operation. There will be, as in any huge transition, there will be losers, there will be gainers. It will be, as Tom said, incredibly complicated, and it will be frightening. And we in this country need to make sure that we navigate that transition while maintaining our social cohesion. And I wanted to talk a little bit about farmers later on. So I thought what might be useful today would just be to talk about, in the National Food Strategy, how we saw, what we saw as the government's role in creating that transition, where I think this government may go, and who knows, but there are various ways in which it could go right or wrong, and then talk a little bit about what your role is, because actually I think this sector has an absolutely critical role to play in this transition. And it's not just about capturing added value within the agri-food system. I think this sector could become a much larger part of the added value in the food system than it is today. So what did we say in the food strategy? We started by recognizing that the food system is incredibly creative, innovative, and has done extraordinary things in the past. We saw it with the Green Revolution, where we went from feeding 2.8 billion people after the war to 8 billion people today, twice the number of calories, off about half the amount of land. Everyone thought we were going to starve to death. We didn't. We're here today. I saw it close up during COVID, when my team was moved from working on the food strategy to working on food supply. Can we feed people? I texted the permanent secretary in early March saying, do we know if we can actually feed people if we go into lockdown? Will we? And she was like, I'm not sure we actually do. And I said, well, maybe we should. And then and we suspended competition law. We had a call that many of you will have been on, FRIF, 8:30 every morning, conference call. And we managed to get the 25% of food that was out, or the food system managed to get the 25% of food that was out of home into homes, get food from city centres out into the countryside where the population had moved, keep food moving across borders, keep abattoirs open. It was really awe-inspiring to watch the food system create that change. When it is incentivized to do something, this sector is incredibly powerful. As a result of the Green Revolution, as everyone here will know, and it was laid out fantastically in the AIC's recent report, the food system now is incredibly damaging. It wasn't intentional. We didn't know that the way in which we changed farming was going to change the outcomes, but it is the case that the food system is the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse, the biggest cause of water shortage, water pollution, soil degradation, deforestation, the biggest cause of the collapse of aquatic life, and also the biggest cause of avoidable ill health in society. And our job now, and the job of the food strategy, was to say, how can we create a secure food system that is resistant to the shocks, including climate change, that produces enough nutrient-rich food to feed us all, while at the same time keeping buoyant rural communities alive, providing economic growth, sequestering carbon, and restoring nature. It is in many ways a simultaneous equation. How? Is it even possible to do all of those things? And the first thing we looked at was, why has it gone wrong? Can we understand how it's gone wrong? And the answer is, in terms of systems theory, you look for the feedback loop that has gone wrong. And what is clear is that nature itself was not represented in any of the financial systems that we use to measure the success of mankind. It's not in our wallets, it's not in the balance sheet of companies, it's not in the way in which we measure GDP. And in fact, Partha Dasgupta, in his Economics of Biodiversity, estimates that we still pay $500 billion every year to activities, industrial farming, fishing, and climate and fossil fuels largely, that actively destroy nature. We did it during the war. We paid farmers. It wasn't their fault. We paid them to grub up hedges. We paid them to farm every single piece of land. People respond to incentives. And so what was clear to us was that the incentives had to change. And then we said, well, okay, if you could manage to get the incentives to change, can you do all of those things, or is that just impossible? And the first thing you have to realize there is that actually you can't, there was this big debate about land sparing and land sharing. You know, do we need to double down on productivity and then have wild land? So we science the shit out of it, as Matt Damon would say in that excellent film where he lands on Mars, and then just have wild land. That was one approach. The other approach is the kind of organic approach. We farm everywhere at a lower level of yield with nature on the farm. And the answer is that we've created biological systems now that exist on farms. So you do need to have some lower yielding farms. You need to have farms where you intentionally have more nature on the farm and slightly lower yields. But if you're going to do that, you also need to have really highly intense farms, less damaging, sustainably intense, but you need to have farms with inputs that are not highly laden in carbon, but producing a high-level food. And then that gives you an ability to have some wilder land. So you have those three habitats. And it is possible to do that. It is possible to do that. You do need to have less meat, and it's not just a carbon thing, but you need to take some meat, for example, from off the uplands in order to bring nature back. That also requires planning change. So, you know, if you're going to fix Cumbria, you need to allow the farmers, if you're going to ask them to take those sheep off, you're going to have to also pay them for the nature restoration, but also allow them to build recreational facilities. So it's a complex set of changes, but you can do it. And we said that there were three fundamental blocks to policy required in this area. One was you need to maintain the ELMS budget, and you need to, over time, move the regulatory baseline up. One of the sad things about this inheritance tax change is that this astonishing, actually, achievement of Daniel Zeitner and Steve Reed to protect the ELMS budget has completely been missed. Treasury were after 100 to 300 million of that budget, and that was fought right up until the last moment. Now, those of you who are around Westminster will also know that the thing about budgets is that they don't have right around. So in any other policy, you have to write around all the government departments so you get a whiff of what's coming. But you don't have to do that on a budget. So you could, for example, if you were Treasury, launch an inheritance tax change without another government department such as DEFRA knowing much about it until right at the last minute. And I'd be interesting to talk to Tom about whether he saw that from the inside. So I actually think that what has gone missed in this budget, and I think that the inheritance tax issues are real, but they are so fixable. And I think that Jeremy Clarkson's stuff in The Sun is outrageous, trying to create a culture war out of it. But I think that is fixable. And I hope that in a year's time, we are saying, thank God they managed to protect the ELMS budget. The second big piece is the land use framework. And this is about being really honest about how we have to use our land. Our land is the scarcest resource we have. And now we don't have fossil fuels. We don't need to just produce our food from it. We need to produce materials from it. We need to produce energy from it. There are all these competing demands. And if you're going to set up policy across all of these government departments, like planning, you need to be really clear about what your requirements are. And it's interesting, I was reminding myself of the Scottish. Scottish are on their third one, and it's fantastic what they're doing, but they still haven't actually got to the nub of the issue, which is being really honest about the trade-offs. And the one thing that I hope from this government on the land use framework is that fundamentally they start a discussion about those trade-offs with a view on what it is now. Because what we need from our land is going to change. The science is going to change. Our demographics are going to change. And if the government publishes the land use framework, here is what we need from our land now, not only will that not be future-proof, but also everyone, there will be trade-offs. So everyone, every stakeholder group will look at that and think, well, that's bad for me. And so, and also the Tories will say this is, because they have a kind of a slight aversion to land use frameworks, they will say, not all of them, but they will say, this is a Stalinist 5-year plan. This is exactly what you expect from Labour. Whereas if the government say, we need to begin to have a discussion about this. This is a long-term, cross-party, cross-government term situation. We will put in a mechanism similar to the Climate Change Committee, where we produce a report on it. We have an obligation to hit certain targets on food security, on climate, on biodiversity, and we will adjust policy every year to try and hit that. Then I think not only will you get a better answer, oh, by the way, and this is what we think it is in year one, we do need them to say what they think it is in year one, but you'll get a better answer, but everyone will see hope in that. All the stakeholders will think, okay, so we're going to continue to have that debate. And when you're interacting with a complex system, you genuinely don't know what's going to happen. One of the great things about DEFRA, what they've done in Elms, is they have changed because they got things wrong and they've put prices up. For example, on species-rich grassland, they got it wrong, they put it up, and it's had a high take-up. So land use framework needs to be long-term. And then the final thing is trade. Because, as Tom says, it is a nonsense to become this kind of utopia of farming in this country and then just let farmers from abroad compete with us to lower standards. You're effectively just exporting your environmental harms abroad. I am not worried by a US trade deal. I don't think any, other than a kind of cosmetic one that Liz Truss was trying to get, I don't think any US government or UK government would be able to sell a trade deal because it would mean access to the UK market to chlorinated chicken and hormone beef. That's what, we're the 5th biggest importer of food in the world. That's where we're exciting to the Americans. And it would mean giving us access to their financial services system. It's not going to happen. I think that's a MacGuffin. But I do think what we do with Europe, with CPTPP, and with Mercosur is really important. I actually think we should take chicken, the industry should take chicken pre-competitively and say, let's solve this. Let's go to the government. We can offer you growth. We can offer you clean water. We need planning to get 600 more chicken sheds because we're going from 36 to 30 kilos. And we need these changes to planning and trade. And I think that would be an exciting piece of work to do. So that's what needs to happen. What will happen? First of all, I'd say, who knows? So Donella Meadows, who was one of the great, who started with Jay Forrester, the science of system dynamics at MIT in the 50s, said you can't control a complex system. It's quite hard to figure it out, but you can dance with it. And the fact is that it isn't just government that's trying to dance with this system. There are all sorts of other actors who are trying to change the food system. So you have capital coming in huge, for example, if you look at the amount of capital that's gone into alternative proteins, unprofitably, interestingly, but it's still completely changed capabilities in that area. You've got competition, you've got customers, and you've got technology. And in technology, I think there are 3 things that I think people have really not clocked yet in terms of how big a part of this transition it's going to be. One is about health, appetite-suppressing drugs. I won't talk about that today, but that could be 15% of the population, I think, on those in the way that they are for SSRIs. This is the first of a whole range coming down the road. In America, the fast-moving consumer goods companies are terrified. The pharma companies are saying, I'll have your profit. And the insurers, who play the role of the state in America, are the ones doing free fruit and vegetable schemes. For capitalist reasons, the insurers are the ones doing the things that our government is too frightened to do. But the other 2 are very relevant here. One is, I think that this link between biological diversity in the soil, nutritional density, microbiome, mental health, and the immune system, our understanding of that is going to explode with our ability to understand complex data or AI. And I think you will see a coming together of regenerative, old wives' tale techniques and modern science techniques. I was at a conference at the Sainsbury's Laboratory the other day in Cambridge with half regenerative farmers and half gene scientists, and it was extraordinary the way that they were falling upon each other, wanting to understand how the other works. So I think that is a huge area that's going to change. And then the other area is your area. So I think there will be, we will not have blue nitrogen in 14 years' time, but the need for biologicals, the need for inputs for those high-yielding farms, we are not going to get the non-input farming anytime soon up to the yield levels we'll need if we want to free up some land. So your industry has an incredibly exciting but also hugely risky future ahead of you. And I just wanted to end by saying we all need what you're going to give us. So good luck with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Those are two absolutely awesome presentations. So once again, we have questions on Slido, but I'm quite happy to have some questions from the floor, and I suspect my speakers might have one or two questions for each other, which is always welcome. But I will start with one straight from Slido. Tom Bradshaw, do you agree with Henry that we can't reach net zero in the UK agriculture sector without reducing the amount of land used to farm livestock?
Can I just?
Sorry?
I didn't say net zero.
Sorry.
So I think biodiversity and land use are more important than carbon when it comes to meat.
But we need to reduce the amount of.
We need to reduce the amount of meat. Yeah, we cannot meet biodiversity and carbon targets without reducing the amount of meat we produce.
So I think this is incredibly complicated. And again, there is the real danger here. So if we look at global systems, and this is the challenge of trying to look at something in isolation in the UK is very, very real. If our beef production is in the top quartile globally for the lowest impact, we shouldn't stop that beef production here. We should stop that beef production in the higher emitting parts of the world where it has more of a climate impact than the beef we produce here. And we should export our beef.
Surely we should control it where we have control. We don't have control in other countries, so we have a duty to maybe look at it here.
Well, no, because all we end up doing is actually exporting out. The world doesn't improve. And climate change is a global issue.
Yeah.
But when it comes to biodiversity, I think that, again, a lot of ground nesting birds do need an element of grazing. And I think what Henry said was, if you're going to remove livestock from the hills for certain periods, you need planning so that there is the ability for them to be housed when they're not doing other things. Because if you simply rewild and you don't have anything grazing that, then there are much wider implications for carbon storage and for ground nesting birds, which I don't think we completely understand.
You can have fewer livestock without, as you put it, completely rewilding.
And there are systems basis to all of this, and I think that what we need to understand, as I said right at some point in my presentation, the impact per unit of output is really, really important, and actually basing it on metrics.
Yeah, so I think increasingly measuring productivity on a total input basis, so looking at how much nature, how much carbon, not just how much pounds went to make productivity. I would just say, we could not find, and we looked at it quite hard, any version where either on a consumption or on a production basis, so we looked at, theoretically you're right, like exporting beef that is better than other beef would be a good thing to do. We couldn't find any area where you didn't need to reduce by 20, 30%. And what I'd say is, it would be quite weird if we just happened to have settled on exactly the right amount of beef to solve that equation. And 20, 30% is not a lot, but it is extraordinary how much of a culture, we wrote about this in the food strategy and in Ravenous, which is our sense of being meat eaters means that these discussions, you could talk, for example, the public don't care about sugar taxes. They're all in favour. If you tried to introduce a meat tax, you would be out of government. So I think that is something, that is where I feel sometimes a bit depressed. I was at the IGD launch of, which is
the Institute of Grocery.
Institute of Grocery D's, distribution. But it's all the CEOs of all the food companies, and they had done their net zero plan. And the euphemism with which they talked about diet change, and like meat wasn't mentioned, and it was like, why can't we just like talk about it? It's not, we're allowed to talk about petrol or fossil fuels being a problem, but we're not allowed to talk about meat. And I think we do need to be a little less pressing.
That's because food is culture, food is joy, food is identity for a lot of people. It's far harder than a lot of these other things.
It is.
I mean,
yeah.
But Tom, just on that.
Although, funnily enough, but that doesn't. So, with sweets, with people don't think. You could say, You'll remember when you were young, a finger of fudge is just enough to give a kid a treat. It was like, you could say that's a kind of a nostalgic thing, but actually people aren't nostalgic about sweets. They've seen that as a problem, whereas with meat it is...
I mean, that is quite literally the icing as opposed to the embedded, John Bull red beef,
Yeah.
All this kind of thing. But, I mean, Tom, would you agree that meat should at least be on the table as part of the discussion, that this coyness perhaps isn't helping?
Well, I'm going to say, we always look at this globally, because we've actually seen...
Isn't that a bit of a get-out?
No, it's not,
it's a bit like a NIMBY, it's a sort of version of NIMBYism,
It's not a get-out unless we're going to have border adjustment mechanisms that stop us being disadvantaged. You can't be in a position where we do less here, and then we're still open to global trade, which undercuts us.
It's a good
I don't think
carbon intensity for import?
I don't think, even if you manage to suppress the methane fully in ruminants, we couldn't work out how you hit your biodiversity targets in the UK. So,
because you need is this because of the land?
You need the land.
That,
you need
that
some
livestock
pasture.
take
You
up?
need
Can I come back to the biodiversity bit? The biodiversity bit is really interesting, and we for so long have got fed up with this line that we're living in one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. Now, officially, depending on which data you look at, we are. But when you look at the map of nature depletion, it's a map of population. It's not a map of nature depletion. So the Sahara Desert is the least impacted by biodiversity decline in the world. There is no biodiversity decline. There's no people. Anywhere where you've got the most populated parts of the world have the highest biodiversity impact. Now, what is it that's having the impact? It's people, okay? And so while the food system might be able to solve it, don't tell us it's the food system or it's farmers' problem. It's the country's problem.
So I'm not sure that's true, actually. So if you look at the biodiversity declines since the 1970s, it hasn't happened in cities. So it's not people.
Or suburbia.
So it's not the farmer's problem. It's like you are growing food for us to eat and to export. And I wish we did export more food, because I think we need to go higher end export. But the decline, the 50% decline, for example, in bird life in this country has happened on farms, not in cities. So I think it's slightly disingenuous to say it's a people problem. It is absolutely correct to say it's not a farmer. It's not, I don't think it is in any way the farmer's fault. All of the incentives that you have to feed us, to make money, to hand on something to your next generation, all lead you to do that, which is why we need to change the incentives. But I don't think it's...
I don't have a vested interest. GWCT website, great report on it.
Okay. I want to move away from that. I just want to ask you something that Tom raised, Henry. I mean, it's a fair point, isn't it, that if we start reducing our carbon emissions in our meat here, and we just import high carbon meat from overseas, and do we need a sort of carbon border tax when it comes to meat? I mean, it's talked about for other things. Do we need it for?
Yeah, I think you'll get. It'll start. EU will do it first, and then I think we will follow. I mean, it was interesting.
So it is a good idea, but we have to.
I think clearly, if you look at the kind of Arthur Pigou was the economist who invented the idea of how you deal with externalities, and all economists accept the way you deal with externalities is you tax them in. So the person who's producing or buying the food pays for the harms they cause. The problem is that is politically often very difficult to do. So it is clear, and if you look at the energy transition, you see that the theoretically correct thing to do would just be to put the price of carbon on all fossil fuels. We didn't do that. We subsidized other forms of energy production until they got below the cost, and so you avoided the social disruption. And so yes, it is theoretically the right thing to do. The question is, what is the thing politically you could do? And a lot of the farmers' protests in the EU recently have been, in my view, due to really bad policy, like good spirited, like policy for the right reasons, but bad policy, like force purchasing dairy farms, or forcing farmers in Wales, forcing farmers to plant 10% of the land with trees, just nutty stuff. And that causes this social disruption. So you have to work out how you do things that are effective and not socially disruptive.
Thank you. Question from David Hewish here. Should the UK focus more on homegrown protein and food security, or does the current SFI, Sustainable Farming Incentive, strike the right balance between food production and the environment? Have we got the balance right, Tom Bradshaw?
It's really simple. We need to see the impact assessments. The last time we saw an impact assessment comprehensively out of DEFRA was in the Michael Gove Health and Harmony consultation. We haven't seen impact assessments for what it will actually deliver for biodiversity, what it will deliver for food production, or what it means, the impact is for food production, and what it means for business viability. And the government need to undertake those impact assessments absolutely critically, so we know the direction this is taking us. Because at the moment, I think we are pretty blindfolded in knowing where this is going. I do think it's quite strange that, well, we're looking at whether we can try and bring in something around supporting proteins grown in this country, because at the moment, you're paid nearly £600 a hectare for a legume fallow, which doesn't produce any food. If you could get 80% of the benefits by growing a legume crop, maybe without insecticides, so that you've still got the pollinator benefits, is there a way of reducing the support payment, but having some support so that you're matching a public and a private good together, rather than the public good having to pay for taking that land completely out of production? So I think that the foundations within the SFI are there. The pressure at the moment is on making sure the rollout works. There's now £1.8 billion expected to go out through the SFI this year, or this next year. That's a lot of pressure on the system, because there's a huge backlog of applications, about 3,500 at the moment sitting there, not out on farm. So the pressure is on getting the system functioning. But then I think we do have to look at, can improvements be made where we combine the private and the public good together, so that we don't take the land completely out of food production.
Just briefly, what's your feeling about the incoming land use framework? Excited about it, worried by it, or how would you put it?
I think we're a little bit agnostic.
Wait and see?
Well, no, I think that there could be benefit. It all depends just how top-down it is, doesn't it? It needs to be bottom-up rather than top-down. And I think it needs to have enough flexibility to make sure that we are prioritising the things that we need to do. So horticulture, huge opportunities for growth.
Yep.
Where's it going to be done? Well, okay, some of it will be done in glass houses. Some of it will be done on our grade 1 silts. Our grade 1 silts are at huge risk of flooding. Are we going to repair it? So there's all these interconnected bits that are really important to protect.
I mean, Henry, you'd know more about this than me, but from my brief conversations with DEFRA, I think it might be quite bottom-up, because they're very worried about the Stalinist tag. So I think they will start acknowledging the trade-offs and not be too prescriptive at the start. But you may now have a better insight.
I think you're never going to... You have to create so you have to say what it is you want from your land, but the top-down incentives will not work. So if you think about the Lake District, for example, it is clear that the Lake District is not producing very much of our food. It's not a food security issue. It's a cultural, one of the kind of great cultural places in our country. It's a massive opportunity for restoring nature, and that it's a massive opportunity for increasing recreation. It's all around Windermere. It shouldn't be. That is not going to be solved on a top-down level. It requires co-creation at a local level. It requires a much more enlightened planning framework. It requires getting the subsidies. At the moment, the subsidies don't work and the sheep are so expensive. There's actually an incentive for the farmers to stop more. So it's really difficult. But you need to get all of those incentives right. So it needs to be you need to be open to the issues, and then get the policies in from the bottom up to create the change.
The uplands is really interesting. There's been a real transition issue in the uplands with the new schemes. They were the original environmentalists, often in the higher tier schemes. They've been locked out pretty well of the new scheme development. It just hasn't really worked in the uplands. So we've got this really perverse outcome where at the moment, many of them are thinking, well, land prices are high, we might as well intensify.
Yeah.
And so the schemes have to urgently be sorted out so they are really fit for purpose for the uplands.
Question here. What is the risk of the National Farmers Union politicising the agricultural property relief change, aping the language of Conservatives' family farm tax attack line? Is there a risk there?
I mean, I think it's probably our attack line originally, so, but let's not argue about that. We have been in the room with the Treasury officials. We are there negotiating. For us, this is completely apolitical. It is about the policy. It's not about the politics. And the policy is wrong. And that is as simple as that. There are solutions that can be put in place. There will be a vast number of farms that aren't impacted. But there's also an assumption that because you know you're going to live for 7 years, you are in a place where you can pass that farm down. Every farmer has reinvested any spare cash within their farm business over the multiple generations. they haven't had a pension in place or been putting a pension in place so they can afford to remove themselves out of their farming business. And the gift fails. If you carry on receiving any benefit from the farm, then the gift fails. So you'd have to pay rent in the farmhouse, you'd have to stop drawing out of the business, or potentially become a paid employee, but that becomes a lot more difficult the older you get. So this perception that you only need 7 years to prepare for an industry that has been reinvesting rather than saving money because they were going to draw on the asset right until the end, it's very, very challenging.
So to be clear, if they staggered the introduction of this to take account of the 7-year problem and the fact that some people are close to death, would you then say, yeah, okay, bit tricky to swallow, but we will?
I think the limits are too low, Tom. I genuinely think that the limits they put in at £1 million.
The million is too low.
Yeah, they're not transferable between spouses, so you end up having to pass it down to the next generation, potentially at an age which is too young. I was really lucky. I'm a 4th generation farmer. I went home at 21. Dad gave me the checkbook, but there's no way Mum and Dad could afford to retire out of the partnership.
What do you think the right limit is?
We're not entering into public negotiations.
Go on.
No.
How do you deal with, so I spend a lot of time in Devon, in the countryside, and I spend a lot of time in East London. And in East London, my kids' state school down the road, they look at you saying, you know, we need a cap at 3 million. And they're like, what the fuck? You know, we've got like, our life has been absolutely miserable. Our businesses go bust all the time. And like the world is difficult. And then these guys are getting really angry. They have the lowest, you have the lowest insolvency rate of any business sector in the country. And you're asking for 3 million. How do you get those people on your side?
And this is a food price issue, Henry. The problem is that for the last sort of 4 or 5 decades, food price inflation hasn't kept up with real times inflation. And while the value of land has gone up.
That may be true, but that doesn't really answer Henry's question.
No, it does, because Tom, I was going on to that, because the return from the asset value is so low. That is the problem. So £3 million is a lot.
The asset value is high, partly because of the tax relief you get.
There is a way. If the question is how do they stop wealth made outside of agriculture coming in and using agricultural land as a tax haven, if that's the question, then let's tell us what the question is. Treasury haven't been able to tell us the question. Tell us what the question is. There is a solution. But to avoid that, you actually have to keep inheritance tax at 40%, not at 20%. Because for those uber wealthy, 20% reduction is still actually quite attractive. And so there is a way through this, but it's not simple.
Henry, I was really intrigued by what you said about, I can't, what the right around, was that the phrase you
Right
used?
around, yeah.
Do you assume that basically what happened was that, and this might be a best guess from you, I'm not saying you know, but the DEFRA managed to get the let's keep the overall subsidy over the line, and the Treasury said, we're going to have to take some money out of agriculture from somewhere, we'll have it.
So I mean, I remember I learned about this. George Osborne always talked from the sugary drinks tax. He always used to say, I would never have got that through unless I'd done it at the budget, because all of the other departments would have come in. The fact that we hadn't heard, I mean, Tom will know more than me, but the fact that we hadn't heard anything about it at all, it was completely out of the blue. If it had been discussed in the department, my guess is that they didn't even roll the, you know, you would have had a discussion, you would have worked out where the problems were, you would have gone to farmers and said, who are the people who unintentionally will get clobbered by this? Because we need to protect them.
But nobody will, Henry. You know, nobody will get clobbered by it. You've heard the minister. It's all fine.
No, he said that's not fair.
He sat here and said nobody.
He said to Alison. He said to Ali. He said, "I would like to see those. I'd love to see those farmers." He said, "Show me the data." And if you go and show them the data of a 93-year-old, then
they've got plenty of data.
Have they?
Yeah.
Let's just to finish, move on to a different topic. Questioner asks, this is probably one for Henry actually. The incoming Trump administration is talking very different language, climate change. Does it represent a serious setback for global sustainable food production?
I think it's so the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act,
which is their Green Deal. Big investment in green tech.
I think this is really interesting. So it's got lots of stuff on farming in it. But Trump is not, there are certain political kind of forces of gravity that I don't think he's immune to. And taking money away from people is a really difficult thing to do, and a lot of those communities are his communities. So I think it'll be very interesting. Like the rhetoric in the first term, there were a lot of stuff he said he'd do that he didn't do, like releasing JFK's assassination documents. But I don't think it's necessarily a disaster. But let's see what he does.
Well, I mean, there may be this. I suspect the question may have been looking. It said global sustainable food production. So I guess the question is, does it have a chilling effect on this global drive to produce food in a more climate-friendly way?
I don't think so. So if you look at currently our emissions, our agricultural emissions are 12% of our total emissions. It's the only sector of the economy that hasn't reduced. In 2035, 2040, it's going to be 50%. So I just think that the eyes are going to be more and more on agriculture and food as the rest of the economy decarbonises. And therefore, the repercussions of climate change will be more and more visible. So I don't think the farmers' protests or Trump are the turning point, and we're all going to forget about it and move on.
Okay, thank you. Tom, respond to that and the actual question, yeah.
I mean, I've been in the US a couple of times over the last 2 years, and it amazes me that we hear that the sustainability goals are global goals for particularly our multinational corporations. The way they are treated in the US is so differently to the way they are treated here. You go out to Midwest US, it's not on the agenda. We're just going to feed the world, and we're going to do it with technology. That's the attitude. Where there is nothing, it does not feature. And even in New York State, I mean, I'm not saying our standards should go backwards. Please don't everyone think that. I'm also not saying the environment or climate change isn't important. I said it there, climate change is our biggest threat. I genuinely believe that. But in the US, in New York State, we went to a large dairy farm. All the runoff from their maize clamps, silage clamps, straight into the river.
Yeah.
And we can't do that. And the cost of regulation of stopping that is huge. Now, somewhere, if these global corporations are applying the same rules, we got very different outcomes. And the same with our assurance schemes and our inspections. The level of inspections in the US, I would say, are far more proportionate. Whereas here, we've got to a place where a horticultural business will expect an inspection every week. It's absolutely bonkers. I mean, it doesn't need to be that level to deliver safe food. And I think that there's a balance here between where we need to be now and how we deliver for the future without a huge cost burden that ultimately creates a regulatory barrier to continuing producing the country's food.
By the way, just a little parenthesis, if you're not on big farming, American big farming social media, I strongly recommend it, because they're constantly doing things like pulling down really beautiful trees with tractors and kind of celebrating that they're creating the culture, because the difference between farming social media in the UK and farming social media in the US is quite stark.
The other thing I like on that is listening to rural-based country music in America, which always absolutely, totally celebrates the heroic nobility of farmers. It'd be right up your street, Tom. I recommend particularly Amarillo Sky, if anybody wants to check out something which is all about their endeavours. Now, we have a Slido question here. It says I should ask you to leave, but actually I will get you to stay, because I think you might want to respond to it. So the next Slido question, which assumes a certain knowledge on behalf of the audience, will the National Food Strategy, does it still sort of exist as a current thing? Is that yours?
I've got one in my bag.
Okay. Will the National Food Strategy provide opportunities for the agri-food industry in coming years? Will the National Food Strategy provide opportunities for the agri-food industry in coming years? I mean, it's kind of what Henry was talking about in his speech. Opportunity, strongly agree, mildly disagree, neutral, mildly agree, strongly agree. Hello. I think I might call that lukewarm support. Mildly agree.
I genuinely think it's a transition. It's both terrifying and exciting in equal measure. That bigger transition is an opportunity and also a massive threat.
Yeah.
There's a big picture challenge here. Obesity is costing the UK economy over £100 billion a year. Our food system should be a system of health, not a system of ill health. And so we may have
The
different...
planet as well as the people.
Well, I think it's got to be in the long term. We do have to solve these issues, but we have to solve them in a fair and just transition. The more you do this to people rather than with people, the bigger the challenge will be. So there's got to be a fair and an equitable transition so that those that are producing the food have a role to play in this. And I think there's a real danger that if we're not careful, it'll be done to the industry.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened in Europe, ultimately.
Yeah.
That it was being done to them, and that was the uprising.
And if you get it wrong, it'll be like the miners. You know, the repercussions of that still ripple through our society. And if we get this transition wrong in our rural communities, it'll be an absolute disaster.
Some very, very good points. And just in case anyone's worried that I've forgotten to introduce Will Jennings from Rabobank and totally ignored him because he is in the programme, I'm sorry to say that he couldn't make it. So it's not been an oversight on behalf of the chair. Those are quite probable, but it wasn't in this case. So it just remains me to say have a great lunch, but particularly thank you so much for a really good chat with Tom Bradshaw and Henry Dimbleby.
Is this